Welcome to the Journeys of Entrepreneurs, episode number 2. Hey, business owners and the Entrepreneur Nation. I'm Joe Breyer, and welcome to the Journeys of Entrepreneurs show, the Joe Show. I'm your host, Joe Breyer, Mergers and Acquisitions Advisor and Certified Business Valuation Analyst with Lakes Business Group. Today's topic is one of the most important questions in mergers and acquisitions. How much is this business worth? We're going to answer that today. Business valuation is one of the most complex processes in mergers and acquisitions. It involves a combination of both art and science. And speaking of science, I want to share with you a quote from the great Albert Einstein before we dive into today's topic. Let's take a look at what he has to say. Thank you, Mr. Einstein. I'll take that advice into consideration, especially when thinking about the complexities of today's topic. The goal for today is to provide an introductory level of understanding for business valuation. It's important to understand there are 3 different approaches one can use when valuing a business. Each approach will lead us to a conclusion of value, and between the 3 different approaches, we develop a range of value for the subject company. These 3 approaches include the asset approach, the market approach, and the income approach. Let's begin with the asset approach. The asset approach is going to focus on the assets of the business. The most common types of assets include the company's cash, their inventory, accounts receivable, equipment, real estate, etc. To understand the value of a company when using this approach, we use the business's balance sheet, which is a financial snapshot of the company's assets, liabilities, and its overall equity. Keeping in mind the advice from Mr. Einstein, I've decided to break out the crayons today to review the accounting equation for the balance sheet. Let's take a look. We realize that assets equals the total liabilities plus the total equity of the business. They balance each other out, hence the name balance sheet. So as we apply the asset approach to determine the value of a business, we need to evaluate all the assets the business owns and determine what their fair market value actually is. The balance sheet may not have their true value recorded. Therefore, we may need to normalize the values from the balance sheet. When we normalize the values, we adjust the balance sheet to bring the assets to their true market value. Let's review an example why this might be needed. Let's take accounts receivable as an example. A company's accounts receivable could have a total overall value on their balance sheet of $175,000, let's say. But as we do a deeper dive, we come to find out that $50,000 of that 175 is actually over 180 plus days uncollected. In that scenario, one could argue if these are ever going to be collected. So you may need to decrease the value of the accounts receivable on the balance sheet accordingly. Another example could include equipment. The equipment value might be depreciated more than what the fair market value of the equipment actually is. Therefore, an adjustment may be needed to increase the value of the equipment, bringing it to its overall fair market value. Once the fair market value of all the assets are determined, you can add up the value of the assets and determine the overall value of the company. It is also important to note the asset approach is typically the floor level value of a business. It does not account for the company's goodwill, like their customer base, the annual earnings, the established brand, etc. Now, let's review the market approach. The second approach is the market approach. This is one of the most common approaches many take to value a business. There are several equations one can use to determine the value when using the market approach. One of the most common is known as the price to earnings ratio. Again, I've broken out the crayons to demonstrate the PE ratio for the market approach. For the PE ratio, if we apply our basic algebra methodologies, you can see that the price would actually equal the ratio times the earnings. So when applying the market approach, we begin by gathering accurate data on similar companies that have recently sold. Ideally, you want to review companies that have recently sold in the same industry, that have similar total annual sales, similar annual earnings, similar geographic locations, etc. The more similar the companies are to the subject company you are trying to value, the more accurate you're going to be. Once you have a good sample of recently sold businesses, you can calculate the appropriate ratio to determine the value of the subject company that you're trying to understand the value of. Let's review an example. Let's say you have 5 companies that you've gathered and analyzed, and they have all recently sold, and they all have an average annual earnings of $500,000. And the overall average sale price of those 5 businesses were $2,875,000. From this analysis, we can then determine that the PE ratio equaled 5.75. We did that by simply taking the overall price of the business and dividing it by the overall earnings. The 2.875 divided by 500,000. That equaled the 5.75. Some call this the market multiple. If the business you are valuing has an annual earnings of $400,000 and you apply that PE ratio of 5.75, you would then have a value of the business of $2.3 million. There are several things I would strongly encourage you to take into consideration when using the market approach. To begin, there are no 2 businesses that are identical to one another. Therefore, because one business is valued at $2.875 million, that does not necessarily mean that the other one is as well. You need to evaluate the intangible assets of the business to determine how to adjust that market multiple. Also, be cautious on reviewing the PE ratio that is being applied to the type of cash flow of the businesses that you're sampling. If a business has $500,000 of annual cash flow, is that annual cash flow EBITDA or is it SDE? SDE stands for seller's discretionary earnings. Those are 2 different types of cash flows. So you must be sure to apply the appropriate PE ratio or market multiple to the appropriate annual earnings. This is one of the biggest mistakes I see in business valuation. Next, let's review the income approach. The income approach is one of my favorite approaches because of the in-depth analysis on the subject company. Again, I break out the crayons to review the valuation equation for the income approach, which is the overall annual earnings divided by the required rate of return equals the overall value. When we use the income approach, we calculate the annual earnings of a company and then we develop a cap rate or the required rate of return. This equation is very similar to the market approach's equation. Here's an example. If the annual earnings of a company were $500,000 and the required rate of return was 20%, then the value would be $2.5 million. If we developed a market multiple and the market multiple was 5, we would arrive to the same conclusion of value. $500,000 of annual earnings times a market multiple of 5 equals $2.5 million. The most difficult challenge with the income approach is calculating the annual earnings as well as developing the required rate of return. The equation is simple, but the two components of the equation involve complex methodologies, which we will cover in another video. I hope this video was informative and insightful. If you have more questions about business valuation, please do not hesitate to visit my website, www.thewindybrew.com, or contact me directly. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, be you, do you, and make it happen. Thanks everyone. See you next time.